You stole my innocence from me. After your normal examination, you would ask me to change into an orange, striped, baggy pair of shorts, which you had never asked me to do before. Then you walked back into the room and asked me to lay on my stomach on the patient table. As you moved closer and closer to an area so private, so off limits, I began to feel more uncomfortable, confused and afraid both at the same time. All I could do was question in my head why you were doing this to me and hope that soon it would be over. 15 to 20 minutes went by when you stopped, and I thought to myself, it's finally over. But you weren't finished yet. You assaulted me again and again.
I was 8 years old when I started seeing Larry after one of my coaches stretched me too hard and fractured my hip. At first I was excited to be working with someone like Larry because he was known to be one of the best and Twistar's go-to guy. He even helped Olympians that I looked up to when I was younger, and so I thought I couldn't get better treatment anywhere else. I was overly confident and I was brave when I was younger, and I thought I was mature enough to handle things on my own. So after a few appointments, after I got to know him, I told my mom that it was okay if I saw him on my own. This is when my appointments with him started making me uncomfortable.
Because of you, Larry, I take medication now for frequent attacks. I sometimes cannot stand my own boyfriend to touch me in the modest of places such as my arm or my leg. It hurts. It is painful. It's scarring. My body is scarred by you. You, Larry, have touched and massaged every part of my body. You covered me with your illness, and I will be contaminated by you for the rest of my life. I will never forget laying in your basement, naked and alone.
Larry Nassar wedged himself between myself and my family and used his leverage as my parents' trusted friend to pry us apart until we fractured. And fracture we did. My relationship with my mother is still marbled with pain, anger, and resentment. And for a long time, I told people that I did not have a family. It was a girl wanting the pain to stop so badly that she woke up for months to the thought, I want to die. For me.
Would you like to withdraw your plea? Because you are guilty, aren't you? Are you guilty, sir?
I said my plea, exactly.
I convinced them that everything I did was wrong and bad. They feel I broke their trust. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. It is just a complete nightmare. I was so manipulated by the AG. Sir, I'm giving you 175 years, which is 2,100 months.
I would ask you to, as part of this sentencing, to grant me 5 minutes in a locked room with this demon.
That is not how
Yes or no?
No, sir, I can't.
Would you give me
do that.
1 minute?
You know that I can't do that. That's not how our legal system
Well, I'm going
works.
to have to stay out.
Imagine being a young gymnast, scared and in pain, walking into a doctor's office for treatment. You trust him completely. He's the team doctor for USA Gymnastics. He's treated Olympic champions. Your parents believe he's helping you heal. But instead of healing, he's destroying you. For over 20 years, Dr. Larry Nassar sexually assaulted hundreds of young athletes under the guise of medical treatment, while institutions that should have protected them turned a blind eye. This isn't just the story of one predator. It's the story of how an entire system failed the most vulnerable, and how the survivors' courage finally brought down America's most prolific sexual abuser. You're about to hear how one man weaponized trust, medical authority, and institutional power to abuse over 265 young women and girls. But this story doesn't end in tragedy. It ends with some of the most powerful victim impact statements in legal history, sentences that ensure Nassar will die in prison, and survivors who transformed their pain into a movement that changed everything. Stay with me because this case proves that sometimes, the most powerful voices belong to those who refuse to stay silent. Lawrence Gerard Nassar was born on August 16, 1963, in Farmington Hills, Michigan, into what appeared to be a typical middle-class American family. From the outside, Larry seemed destined for success, intelligent, charismatic, and drawn to the world of sports medicine from an early age. He would grow up to become one of the most trusted figures in American athletics, and simultaneously, one of the most dangerous predators in the country's history. Nassar's path to becoming a doctor began at the University of Michigan, where he earned his bachelor's degree in kinesiology in 1985. He was the kind of student who impressed professors and peers alike, dedicated, knowledgeable, and seemingly passionate about helping athletes achieve their dreams. He continued at Michigan for his medical degree, graduating from the College of Medicine in 1993, specializing in sports medicine and osteopathic manipulative therapy. What made Nassar particularly dangerous was his genuine expertise in his field. He wasn't a fraud or a quack. He was a legitimately skilled physician who understood the human body and knew how to treat athletic injuries. This expertise gave him credibility that would prove devastating for his future victims. Parents, coaches, and athletes themselves had no reason to question his methods because he was, in many respects, exactly what he claimed to be, a highly trained sports medicine physician. By the mid-1990s, Nassar had positioned himself at the heart of American gymnastics. He became the team physician for USA Gymnastics women's artistic gymnastics team and also worked as an associate professor at Michigan State University's College of Osteopathic Medicine. These dual roles gave him access to young athletes at both the elite and collegiate levels, creating a perfect storm of opportunity and authority that he would exploit for over 2 decades. What made Nassar so effective as a predator was his ability to build trust not just with his victims, but with their families and the institutions that employed him. He was known for being available at all hours, for going above and beyond in his care for athletes, and for developing personal relationships that made families feel their daughters were in safe hands. He would text with athletes, check on their well-being, and present himself as someone who truly cared about their success and happiness. Nassar's method of abuse was particularly insidious because he disguised it as legitimate medical treatment. He claimed to be performing a specialized form of pelvic floor therapy that required internal manipulation, a technique that he told athletes and their parents was cutting-edge treatment for various athletic injuries and conditions. The genius of this approach was that it provided him with medical justification for sexual contact while creating an environment where questioning his methods seemed inappropriate or even harmful to the athlete's treatment. Parents who might have been suspicious of any other adult's behavior toward their daughters accepted Nassar's explanations because he was a doctor, because he had medical credentials, and because he presented his treatments as necessary for their daughter's athletic success. Between 1995 and 2015, according to testimony in court filings, 13 girls and women said they raised complaints about Nassar, who continued to treat and assault his patients until the 14th went to law enforcement and the Indianapolis Star in August 2016. This timeline reveals the systematic failure of institutions to investigate and act on repeated warnings about Nassar's behavior. The abuse typically occurred in clinical settings, his office at Michigan State, training facilities for USA Gymnastics, and even at major competitions including the Olympics. Nassar would often abuse athletes when they were alone, but sometimes he would assault them with parents or coaches in the room, confident that his medical authority would prevent anyone from questioning what they were witnessing. Many victims later described feeling confused and uncomfortable during these treatments, but being told by Nassar that their discomfort was normal, that the treatment was necessary, and that questioning it showed they weren't serious about their athletic goals. He weaponized their dedication to their sport, telling them that Olympic champions had undergone the same treatments and that their success depended on trusting his medical expertise. What makes the Larry Nassar case particularly horrifying is not just the scope of his abuse, but the systematic failure of multiple institutions to protect the athletes in their care. USA Gymnastics, Michigan State University, and even the FBI all had opportunities to stop Nassar years before he was finally arrested. but bureaucratic failures, institutional self-interest, and a culture that prioritized reputation over safety allowed him to continue abusing young women and girls. USA Gymnastics first received complaints about Nassar's behavior as early as 2015, but instead of immediately reporting these complaints to law enforcement, the organization conducted its own internal investigation. This delay was costly. While USA Gymnastics was conducting meetings and consultations with lawyers, Nassar continued to see patients and continued to abuse them. The organization's primary concern seemed to be managing liability and public relations rather than protecting current and future victims. Michigan State University's failures were equally egregious. Multiple staff members, coaches, and administrators received reports about Nassar's inappropriate behavior over the years, but these reports were either dismissed, inadequately investigated, or simply ignored. The university's own investigation later revealed that at least 14 MSU representatives had received complaints about Nassar between 1997 and 2016, yet he remained employed and continued to have access to vulnerable students. In May 2022, the Department of Justice refused to arrest any FBI agent that was involved in the failure to investigate for 14 months. The FBI's handling of the Nassar case represents one of the most significant law enforcement failures in recent memory. When the Indianapolis Star broke the story in August 2016, USA Gymnastics finally reported the allegations to the FBI. However, the FBI's Indianapolis field office failed to open a formal investigation, failed to interview key witnesses, and failed to notify local law enforcement in Michigan where many of the crimes had occurred. This 14-month delay by the FBI was not just a bureaucratic failure, it had real consequences. During this period, Nassar continued to abuse athletes, and the FBI's inaction emboldened him to believe he was untouchable. It wasn't until local law enforcement in Michigan began investigating Nassar on separate charges related to child pornography that the full scope of his sexual abuse began to emerge. The beginning of the end for Larry Nassar came when brave survivors began speaking publicly about their abuse. The first major breakthrough came in September 2016 when Rachel Den Hollander, a former gymnast who had been abused by Nassar as a teenager, went public with her story in an Indianapolis Star investigation. Her courage in speaking out, despite knowing the personal cost, opened the floodgates for other survivors to come forward. What followed was an avalanche of similar accounts from athletes across multiple sports and spanning more than 2 decades. Olympic champions, college athletes, and young girls who had trained at local gyms all began sharing eerily similar stories of abuse disguised as medical treatment. The consistency of these accounts made it impossible to dismiss them as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. The most powerful moment in the entire case came during Nassar's sentencing hearings in early 2018. Over the course of 7 days, 156 victims gave impact statements in court, creating one of the most extraordinary displays of survivor courage in legal history. These were not just statements, they were acts of reclamation, as survivors took back their power and forced Nassar to hear the full impact of his crimes. Larry, you do realize now that we, this group of women you so heartlessly abused over such a long period of time, are now a force and you are nothing. The tables have turned, Larry, Raisman said in her 13-minute statement. We have our voices and we are not going anywhere. Aly Raisman's statement captured the transformation of these women from victims to survivors to advocates. Perhaps the most devastating testimony came from McKayla Maroney, who described being abused by Nassar at the 2011 World Championships in Tokyo and at the 2012 Olympics in London, the very competitions that were supposed to represent the pinnacle of her athletic career. Her statement revealed how Nassar had poisoned even her greatest achievements with his abuse. In 2017 and 2018, Nassar pleaded guilty to federal charges of child pornography and state charges of first-degree sexual assault. He received sentences of 60 years in prison plus another 80 to 300 years. These sentences ensured that Nassar would never again have the opportunity to harm another child. The federal charges were based on a cache of child pornography found on Nassar's computers, while the state charges in Michigan focused on his sexual assault of minors. Judge Rosemary Aquilina, who presided over the state sentencing, became a hero to survivors when she allowed every victim who wanted to speak to do so, despite pressure to limit the proceedings. Her decision to prioritize the survivors' voices over courtroom efficiency sent a powerful message about whose perspectives mattered most. The judge in charge of the federal case ordered his state and federal sentences to run consecutively, ensuring a de facto sentence of life imprisonment without parole. This decision eliminated any possibility that Nassar might someday be released, providing survivors with the certainty that he would never again pose a threat to young athletes. But the survivors wanted more than just Nassar's imprisonment. They demanded accountability from the institutions that had enabled his abuse. Their advocacy led to congressional hearings where Olympic champions faced lawmakers and demanded answers about the systematic failures that had allowed Nassar to operate with impunity for so long. Biles and fellow gymnasts McKayla Maroney, Aly Raisman and Maggie Nichols testified about their abuse in graphic detail at a hearing on the FBI's mishandling of the Nassar case. In September 2021, Simone Biles, Aly Raisman, McKayla Maroney, and Maggie Nichols testified before Congress about both their abuse and the institution's failures to protect them. Biles, fighting back tears, told lawmakers, "We have been failed and we deserve answers." The revelations about Nassar's abuse and the institutional failures that enabled it led to unprecedented consequences for USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University. USA Gymnastics filed for bankruptcy in 2018, overwhelmed by lawsuits from survivors and facing the loss of its primary revenue streams. The organization's entire board of directors resigned, and it was eventually taken over by new leadership committed to implementing survivor-centered reforms. Michigan State University faced similar reckoning, ultimately agreeing to pay $500 million to settle claims from survivors, one of the largest settlements in the history of sexual abuse cases. The university's president, athletic director, and numerous other officials resigned or were fired. The scandal fundamentally changed how the university operates, with new policies and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar failures in the future. The DOJ settlement goes to 139 victims of Larry Nassar, the disgraced team doctor of USA Gymnastics who sexually assaulted elite and Olympic gymnasts, after the FBI failed to promptly investigate. In 2024, the Department of Justice agreed to pay $138.7 million to settle claims from Nassar survivors related to the FBI's investigative failures, finally acknowledging the agency's role in allowing the abuse to continue. While the legal and institutional consequences of the Nassar case were significant, the personal cost to survivors cannot be measured in dollars or policy changes. Many survivors have spoken about the long-term impact of the abuse on their mental health, their relationships, and their ability to trust. Some left gymnastics entirely, their love for the sport poisoned by their association with their abuser. The courage required for survivors to come forward cannot be overstated. They faced disbelief, victim blaming, and intense scrutiny of their private lives. Many were threatened with lawsuits by USA Gymnastics if they spoke publicly about their abuse. The fact that they persisted despite these obstacles speaks to their incredible strength and their commitment to protecting future generations of athletes. According to a statement from the Bureau of Prisons, on Sunday, July 9, 2023 at approximately 2:35 p.m., an inmate was assaulted at the United States Penitentiary USP Coleman II in Sumterville, Florida. Responding staff immediately initiated life-saving measures. In July 2023, Nassar was stabbed multiple times by another inmate while in federal prison, requiring life-saving medical treatment. While violence in prison is never appropriate, many survivors and their advocates saw this as evidence that even among criminals, those who abuse children are considered the lowest form of life. The Nassar case did more than just put one predator behind bars. It catalyzed a broader movement to protect young athletes from abuse. The survivors' advocacy led to federal legislation requiring sports organizations to report suspected abuse and creating clearer protocols for investigating complaints. Their work has influenced policies at youth sports organizations across the country, making it harder for future predators to operate with impunity. The case also contributed to broader cultural conversations about believing survivors, the dynamics of institutional abuse, and the ways that authority figures can exploit their positions to harm those they're supposed to protect. The #MeToo movement was already underway when the Nassar case reached its peak, but the survivors' testimonies added powerful voices to the national conversation about sexual abuse and accountability. On January 31, 2018, a Michigan judge said that there were over 265 identified victims and an infinite number of victims of sexual misconduct. The full scope of Nassar's abuse may never be known, but the identified victims represent one of the largest sexual abuse cases in American history. While Nassar will spend the rest of his life in prison, and while the institutions that enabled him have faced significant consequences, many survivors continue to struggle with the long-term effects of their trauma. Some have found healing through advocacy work, using their experiences to protect others. Others have chosen to rebuild their lives away from the public eye, focusing on their families and personal recovery. The case also highlighted the limitations of the criminal justice system in addressing institutional abuse. While individual predators like Nassar can be prosecuted and imprisoned, changing the cultures and systems that enable such abuse is a much longer and more complex process. The survivors' ongoing advocacy work recognizes that true justice requires not just punishment for past crimes, but prevention of future ones. The legacy of the Larry Nassar case is not the story of one man's crimes, but the story of hundreds of survivors who refused to stay silent and who transformed their pain into a force for change. Their courage in speaking out, despite enormous personal cost, has made youth sports safer for future generations and has contributed to broader cultural shifts in how we respond to reports of sexual abuse. Olympic champions like Simone Biles, Aly Raisman, and McKayla Maroney could have chosen to remain silent about their abuse, protecting their privacy and their careers. Instead, they used their platforms to amplify the voices of all survivors, ensuring that the stories of less famous victims were heard alongside their own. Their advocacy demonstrates that true strength is not just physical prowess, but the courage to speak truth to power. The case also demonstrated the power of journalism in exposing institutional failures and giving voice to survivors. The Indianapolis Star's initial investigation provided a platform for Rachel Denhollander and other early survivors to tell their stories, creating the momentum that ultimately brought down not just Nassar but the systems that protected him. As we remember the Larry Nassar case, we must honor not just the survivors' pain, but their incredible strength in transforming that pain into protection for others. Their voices echo in every new policy designed to protect young athletes, in every investigation that takes survivors' reports seriously, and in every moment when someone chooses to believe a child who says they've been harmed. Larry Nassar is exactly where he belongs, in a prison cell where he will remain until he dies. But the real victory belongs to the survivors who refused to let his crimes remain hidden, who demanded accountability from the institutions that failed them, and who continue to fight for a world where young athletes can pursue their dreams without fear of abuse. Their courage reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can triumph, that survivors can reclaim their power, and that sometimes the most important victories are won not in courtrooms but in the hearts and minds of people who choose to believe, to act, and to change the world for the better. The doctor they trusted became their abuser, but their trust in each other, in their own experiences, and in their power to create change became the force that brought him down and continues to protect others. That is the true legacy of their courage, and that is why their voices will never be silenced again.